Hello and welcome back to another update. As we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, we've had developments in the Avdiivka direction as well as in the Terni direction, but we start out in the Krinky direction where there's been no developments. The reason why I start out here in the Krinky direction is because there was recently released an article by the Washington Post titled Ukraine Marines Recount Deadly Mission to 3 Towns East of Dnieper River. The point of the whole article is that they constantly go across the riverline, but there's no results. Their mission is to capture villages. They need to recapture villages to show some sort of results in this time where the Ukrainians have so far failed to get any significant results. Yet we're seeing that all they have managed to do is gain a foothold in Krinky, and since then their area that they're holding has just shrunk. It has gone down, not increased. The operation was supposed to capture multiple villages, but instead we're seeing nothing except for a foothold in Krinky. They don't even hold the whole village. So we're seeing constant attempts by the Ukrainians to go over the Dnieper River, launch motorboats, but in the end it turns out that there was nothing to gain from this sort of mission. It ended up being a meat grinder for the Ukrainians in this section of the front line. So with the meat grinder in Krinky, the meat grinder in Bakhmut, the meat grinder in Zaporizhia, the meat grinder in Kreminna, we end up seeing a lot of Ukrainian soldiers being lost. The same with Russian soldiers, but the Russians managed to mobilize partially the 300,000 soldiers, then they recruited above 400,000 soldiers in 2023. That is an additional 700,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are struggling to mobilize. A recent statement by Zaluzhny, where he was talking to the Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament in Ukraine, they did not adopt a new law on mobilization. To which he responded, "Who should I fight with? Either turn to the world and ask people there, as in abroad, to go and help Ukraine, or go fight if you don't provide." So he's telling to the politicians to go fight themselves. "I need people. The Russians have already called up 400,000. Give me people," demands Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny. Then he also spoke out against the mobilization of convicts, which happened at the start of the war, and there's been talks of them doing it again, where he asks, is the army for bad people? Is it only bad people who should go to the army? A very valid question, because we've seen historically that prisoners haven't really acted that well in war. This war has actually shown how the Russians and the Ukrainians have been able to adapt prisoners to actually fight in a war. And this is actually revolutionary. Despite them having a higher death rate, higher problems, more problems, military discipline, and so on, they have still been fairly useful compared to other points in history. So we have seen that the Russians and the Ukrainians have been able to successfully mobilize convicts. But then again, it is not that they are able to use the whole army as only including prisoners. First of all, they don't really have enough prisoners at all. But if the majority of the people are undisciplined, then your army is catastrophic. If you have a smaller amount, you can spread them out across the front or other things. But we've seen that they have used mainly prisoner units, which shows that they're able to create units which are mainly prisoner based, and they still follow orders most of the time. And as such, we see that they are fairly reliable. But it is not something that works in the long term, and it is definitely not something you can do by yourself. Because in the end, if all the prisoners in the country got weapons and the normal people don't have weapons, then what stops them from creating a mutiny between the state and the soldiers? We then move on to the Avdiivka direction, where there's been multiple reports. First off, Zodiac Maps reports a recent advance by the Russians, capturing this forest line here to the west of the railways. And as I mentioned in the previous analysis, it looks like the Russians will continue moving up the railways and then expand outwards to solidify their flank here in the northern section of the front line. But again, this raises the question, how much longer are they going to expand before they actually start storming the villages here in the northern flank? If the Russians don't hold the Pove, for example, they will never be able to storm the coke plant. And if they don't hold the dacha areas, they won't either. So the Russians need to advance further in these directions. We have seen a recent advance in the dacha area, but this is not nearly enough. They need full control of it before the Battle of the Avdiivsky coke plant can start. And when the Avdiivsky coke plant battle starts, that is the beginning of the end of Avdiivka. We cannot talk about the end of Avdiivka before we talk about the start of the Battle of the coke plant. In addition to this, we also see in the northern direction, in the direction of Terni, further Russian advances in this direction. They've managed to cover about 7 square kilometers of territory in the northeastern part of Terni, and with this we see that the front line here is widening as well. We're seeing that the Russians just continue widening things here at the front line. The front is moving to the sides, not forward. This raises the question as to why do they keep expanding the front line? Why don't they start storming villages? Again, this is because we're seeing that the Ukrainians are running not just low on manpower, but also ammunition. This means that if we have 1,000 Russian soldiers here in this part of the front line, then in every part of it, there will be a higher concentration of Russian soldiers. If they then are spread across a wider front, then the concentration becomes much smaller, and the Ukrainians would have to use the same amount of artillery, but on more targets. This means that the Russian casualty rate would decrease based on the amount of artillery shells the Ukrainians launch. This puts further pressure on the Ukrainian artillery systems and their ammunitions. So we're seeing constant drain of Ukrainian ammunition and a now lack of manpower that is not being dealt with. So without additional aid from the United States and Europe, we will not see any potential for a Ukrainian recovery in this war. This is why I tweeted on the 5th of December, which is exactly 1 month ago, where I wrote, "For Ukraine, the war has already been lost. It becomes worse and worse the more days go by. Without direct interference by Western nations, Ukraine can never win this war." There's no potential for Ukraine winning this war. The reason for that is the Russians are significantly outproducing and out recruiting the Ukrainians. They have more men, they have more artillery, they have more weapons, and so on. Yet at the same time, the support the Ukrainians received at the start of the war was much more than what they're receiving now. Yes, the Ukrainians may receive F-16 fighter jets, but what does F-16 fighter jets mean when you have half the amount of soldiers you had half a year ago? Then comes this very interesting article by a Swiss paper which interviewed the EU chief of training the Ukrainian soldiers. He replies to one of the questions, what sort of soldiers are sent for you to train them? He then replies, this Ukrainians send us soldiers who have hardly any knowledge or experience. They take people from the streets, mobilize them, and send them to the EU to be trained. So they don't have the basic training, which was supposed to be provided by Ukraine, so that when they arrive at the EU, they would have more advanced training, more specialized training. They have a couple of weeks to train these soldiers from the bottom, from normal civilians, until advanced soldiers. That is not possible. He mentions that the reason why the Ukrainians are sending untrained soldiers to the EU instead of training them in Ukraine is because the Russian strikes on Ukrainian barracks all throughout the country is very heavy. The Ukrainians are taking a lot of casualties whenever they have large concentrations of Ukrainian soldiers. So there's been a rule set in Ukraine that they cannot gather too many troops in one place, because whenever that happens, the Russians always strike. They always strike. There's hardly any case where they have gathered in large numbers that there hasn't been a Russian strike. So these in-depth strikes by the Russians turn out to be very successful, despite whatever they want to tell you otherwise. So we're seeing that the strikes that the Russians constantly launch into Ukraine have caused the Ukrainians to send untrained, recently mobilized people to the EU to be trained, which significantly decreases the efficiency of these training periods in the EU. They either need to extend them drastically or get some other quick fix. But that's currently not happening. Instead, we are seeing that the EU only provides basic training for these soldiers to then be sent to the front line, because there's no proper place for them to train further. And at the same time, with the lack of soldiers, there is not enough being sent to the EU. There's no further capacity by the EU to train more soldiers than what they're already training, and so many other issues, which all end up being a detrimental effect to the Ukrainians. And at the same time, the deep strikes the Ukrainians do on Russian territory do not have the same capacity. They do not hit the barracks of Russian soldiers nearly to the same point that the Russians are doing. We may see sometimes deployment zones in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions being hit, where hundreds of Russian soldiers get hit in a single place. This has happened multiple times. However, it can be counted on my hands by my fingers how many times. While the times it has happened on the opposite side was more by the Russians hitting Ukrainian positions in the first month of the war than what has been the opposite throughout the whole war. So the Russians are significantly outstriking the Ukrainians in these far distance strikes. This is why we're seeing constant requests by Ukraine to get long-range missile systems, long-range missiles from the planes that can be attached to the F-16, for example, so that they are able to do the same. But that is not happening so far, and this is unlikely to happen because the clock is ticking for Ukraine. After seeing these recent developments, these recent interviews, it has become ever the more clearer that the Ukrainians are heavily struggling right now because of a lack of manpower and lack of ammunition. There's been no significant package by the West in over half a year now. And they didn't even receive what they wanted back in summer, so everything that they've lost since is in addition to what they didn't even receive in the first place. And now we're seeing that they also have a lack of manpower. The future is bleak for the war in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side, and the Russians are simply just improving the position as much as possible, taking advantage of whatever small thing they can, and continuing this war of attrition, because in the end we don't really see them launching any major assaults. They just do these smaller positional fighting by the front line. The Battle of Avdiivka very slow, but we're not really seeing the Russians lose territory anywhere in the Avdiivka front. We're instead seeing them constantly advancing these tiny advances, but they're advancing nonetheless. And the Ukrainians are struggling to counterattack. We do, however, see that there is this UAKted footage here, which shows Ukrainian positions being hit by Russian strikes here in the north. The question is this recent footage or not? We cannot tell. Soon there will be coming a snowstorm to Ukraine, then it will be much clearer. If there's snow in it, then it's recent. But until then, we don't know for sure. But if it is recent, then the Ukrainians have managed to recapture this first line here. But again, how much does that even add up in the grand scale of things? When in the end, the Ukrainians right now are more focusing on defense than anything else, because in the defense is when they lose the least soldiers. When they attack, that is when it becomes much more difficult. So in the end, we see that the Ukrainians are struggling, and it is becoming more and more difficult. Every day that goes by, as I said on the 5th of December, I repeated here on the 5th of January. I don't know if the war will last another year, just a month, 10 years. But in the end, what comes out on the other side is a Ukraine with no people and no economy. And that is not a victory in any sense. So I believe the point we are at right now is the final turning point of this war. After a couple of turning points and unseen developments, where the Ukrainians turned out to be much more resilient and much more stronger than anyone really expected, we now see that in the end, the stronger economical and military might wins in the end in an attritional war. And we may see possible future incursions by the Russians, which I will cover in a future video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.